The Novels of Charles Dickens. An introduction by David Timson. Nicholas Nickleby. On the 30th of January 1838, Charles Dickens set out on a secret journey to Yorkshire. The object of the trip was to investigate the private boarding schools which were gaining a reputation in the law courts for being dens of cruelty, abuse and deprivation, with barely rudimentary schooling actually taking place. No qualifications, it seems, were needed to open a school, and any man might call himself a schoolmaster, and the Yorkshire schoolmasters, according to Dickens, were the lowest and most rotten round in the whole ladder. Once in his clutches, young children who were in the way of their parents, or an embarrassment because they were illegitimate, were kept virtual prisoners by a sadistic schoolmaster who plainly indicated that the parents need not ever concern themselves again with their troublesome offspring as long as they paid the £20 per annum. The phrase, "no vacations," was prominently included in the newspaper advertisements for these dens of iniquity. It was these advertisements that had led Dickens on his quest. Posing as a friend of a widow who was looking for schooling for her son, he made inquiries on arriving in Yorkshire, and soon met with the man he was to immortalise as Wackford Squeers, proprietor of Do the Boys Hall, in his next novel, Nicholas Nickleby. The prototype of Squeers was a Mr. Shaw of Bowes Academy. Boys under his care had gone blind through his neglect and ill-treatment of them, and he had been prosecuted. Yet, after a fine, he continued to operate. Dickens's transformation of fact into a fiction that was read worldwide led to a public outcry against these hell-holes of education, and as he says in the preface to the 1848 edition of Nickleby, there are very few now. If the exposure of the cheap Yorkshire schools and their demise, as a result of his efforts, represents Dickens's public conscience, then the creation of Mr. Vincent Crummles and his theatre company represents his private pleasure. Dickens had loved the theatre since he was a child, and acting was so much a part of his nature. Indeed, whilst a struggling journalist, Dickens had obtained an audition to join the company of the Covent Garden Theatre, but a bad cold deprived him of his voice, and he cancelled it. By the time another audition was offered him, his career had moved inexorably away from that of an actor's, and he was making his name as an author. But his love of theatre never left him. Whenever he had the opportunity, he would mount amateur productions with his friends, Dickens taking charge of all aspects of the production, including the stage management, with his customary vigour. His daughter Kate, in her memoirs, also recalls the actor's gift in her father, for having hidden herself away in his study as a child, she secretly observed his way of working. Dickens would act out his characters in front of a mirror, improvising speeches, and then furiously writing them down before he forgot them. Vincent Crummles, the exuberant actor-manager, his formidable wife, famed for her performance of The Blood Drinker, and the ageless infant phenomenon are Dickens's affectionate tribute to the world of which he might have professionally been a part, had not fate intervened. In Nicholas Nickleby, Dickens uses the frame of the picaresque novel, where the young hero or heroine sets out on their travels to seek their fortunes. Its advantage for Dickens is that on a journey, the central character has the opportunity to meet many different characters in many different locations. Thus, in Yorkshire, Nicholas Nickleby meets characters as diverse as the dysfunctional Squeers family and their abused charge Smike, as well as the good-hearted John Browdie. In London, the eccentric but supportive Newman Noggs and Miss La Creevy come to the aid of Nicholas and his family, whilst on the road to Portsmouth he meets and joins the Crummles theatrical troupe. Nor does Dickens neglect to show us London, as Kate, Nicholas's sister, is introduced into its society, satirized in the vapid hypochondriac Mrs. Wititterly and the corrupt and vicious Sir Mulberry Hawk, whilst the unfeeling London financial world is represented by Ralph Nickleby, a cruel and ruthless businessman who sits like a poisonous spider at the heart of this story. With the theatre so much a part of Nicholas Nickleby, it is not surprising that it was quickly adapted for the stage, even before Dickens had finished writing it. The most popular characters in these adaptations mirrored the public's choice. Mr. Mantalini, the philandering husband of Kate's employer, and Smike proved to be the greatest stage successes. In the 1980s, the Royal Shakespeare Company produced a gripping and colourful stage version over 2 consecutive nights, lasting a total of over 4 hours. Mrs. Nickleby, too, is a comic masterpiece. She is based on Dickens's own mother, who was renowned in the family for her garrulous and rambling narratives. Nicholas and his sister's adventures are told with such a racy spirit, too, that the reader is swept along with them. The pace of the novel testifies once again that Dickens was writing furiously to produce the monthly instalments on time, having so much other work to accomplish. He began writing Nicholas Nickleby as he was still finishing Oliver Twist. At the same time he was editing a magazine, as well as the jumbled memoirs of the famous clown Grimaldi. It was a considerable workload. His friend Forster said, "At this time he never wrote without the printer at his heels." Nicholas in Yorkshire, with Wackford Squeers.
"Now," said Squeers, giving the desk a great rap with his cane, which made half the little boys nearly jump out of their boots. "Is that physicking over?" "Just over," said Mrs. Squeers, choking the last boy in her hurry, and tapping the crown of his head with the wooden spoon to restore him. "Here, you, Smike, take away now. Look sharp." Smike shuffled out with the basin, and Mrs. Squeers, having called up a little boy with a curly head and wiped her hands upon it, hurried out after him into a species of wash-house where there was a small fire and a large kettle, together with a number of little wooden bowls which were arranged upon a board. Into these bowls Mrs. Squeers, assisted by the hungry servant, poured a brown composition which looked like diluted pincushions without the covers, and was called porridge. A minute wedge of brown bread was inserted in each bowl, and when they had eaten their porridge by means of the bread, the boys ate the bread itself, and had finished their breakfast. Whereupon Mr. Squeers said in a solemn voice, "For what we have received, may the Lord make us truly thankful," and went away to his own. Nicholas distended his stomach with a bowl of porridge, for much the same reason which induces some savages to swallow earth, lest they should be inconveniently hungry when there is nothing to eat. Having further disposed of a slice of bread and butter allotted to him in virtue of his office, he sat himself down to wait for school-time. He could not but observe how silent and sad the boys all seemed to be. There was none of the noise and clamour of a schoolroom, none of its boisterous play or hearty mirth. The children sat crouching and shivering together, and seemed to lack the spirit to move about. The only pupil who evinced the slightest tendency towards locomotion or playfulness was Master Squeers, and as his chief amusement was to tread upon the other boys' toes in his new boots, his flow of spirits was rather disagreeable than otherwise. After some half-hour's delay, Mr. Squeers reappeared, and the boys took their places and their books, of which latter commodity the average might be about 1 to 8 learners. A few minutes having elapsed, during which Mr. Squeers looked very profound, as if he had a perfect apprehension of what was inside all the books, and could say every word of their contents by heart if he only chose to take the trouble, that gentleman called up the first class. Obedient to this summons, there ranged themselves in front of the schoolmaster's desk 6 scarecrows out at knees and elbows, one of whom placed a torn and filthy book beneath his learned eye. "This is the first class in English spelling and philosophy, Nickleby," said Squeers, beckoning Nicholas to stand beside him. "We'll get up a Latin one and hand that over to you. Now then, where's the first boy?"
"Please, sir, he's cleaning the back parlour window," said the temporary head of the philosophical class.
"So he is, to be sure," rejoined Squeers. "We go upon the practical mode of teaching, Nickleby, the regular education system. C-L-E-A-N, clean, verb active, to make bright, to scour. W-I-N, win. D-E-R, der, winder, a casement. When the boy knows this out at book, he goes and does it. It's just the same principle as the use of the globes. Where's the second boy?
"Please, sir, he's weeding the garden," replied a small voice.
Oh, to be sure, said Squeers, by no means disconcerted. So he is. B-O-T, bot. T-I-N, tin. Bottin, N-E-Y, nay, botany, noun substantive, a knowledge of plants. When he has learnt that botany means a knowledge of plants, he goes and knows them. That's our system, Nickleby. What do you think of it?
"It's a very useful one, at any rate," answered Nicholas.
I believe you,
rejoined Squeers, not remarking the emphasis of his usher.
Third boy, what's a horse?
"A beast, sir," replied the boy.
So it is, said Squeers. Ain't it, Nickleby?
"I believe there is no doubt of that, sir," answered Nicholas.
Of course there isn't, said Squeers. A horse is a quadruped, and quadruped's Latin for beast, as everybody that's gone through the grammar knows. Or else, where's the use of having grammars at all?
"Where indeed?" said Nicholas abstractedly.
As you're perfect in that, resumed Squeers, turning to the boy, go and look after my horse, and rub him down well, or I'll rub you down. The rest of the class, go and draw water up till somebody tells you to leave off, for it's washing day tomorrow, and they want the coppers filled.
So saying, he dismissed the first class to their experiments in practical philosophy, and eyed Nicholas with a look half cunning and half doubtful, as if he were not altogether certain what he might think of him by this time.
That's the way we do it, Nickleby, he said, after a pause.
Kate at the Mantolini's.
They waited here a much longer time than was agreeable to Mr. Ralph Nickleby, who eyed the gaudy frippery about him with very little concern, and was at length about to pull the bell, when a gentleman suddenly popped his head into the room, and seeing somebody there, as suddenly popped it out again. "Here! Hollo!" cried Ralph. "Who's that?" At the sound of Ralph's voice, the head reappeared, and the mouth, displaying a very long row of very white teeth, uttered in a mincing tone the words, "Damn it! What, Nickleby? Oh, damn it!" Having uttered which ejaculations, the gentleman advanced and shook hands with Ralph with great warmth. He was dressed in a gorgeous morning gown with a waistcoat and Turkish trousers of the same pattern, a pink silk neckerchief, and bright green slippers, and had a very copious watch-chain wound round his body. Moreover, he had whiskers and a moustache, both dyed black and gracefully curled. "Damn it, you don't mean to say you want me, do you, damn it?" said this gentleman, smiting Ralph on the shoulder. "Not yet," said Ralph, sarcastically. "Ha, ha! Damn it!" cried the gentleman, when, wheeling round to laugh with greater elegance, he encountered Kate Nickleby, who was standing near. "My niece," said Ralph. "I remember," said the gentleman, striking his nose with the knuckle of his forefinger as a chastening for his forgetfulness. "Damn it, I remember what you come for. Step this way, Nickleby. My dear, will you follow me? Ha, ha! They all follow me, Nickleby. Always did, damn it, always." Giving loose to the playfulness of his imagination after this fashion, the gentleman led the way to a private sitting-room on the second floor, scarcely less elegantly furnished than the apartment below, where the presence of a silver coffee-pot, an egg-shell, and sloppy china for one, seemed to show that he had just breakfasted. "Sit down, my dear," said the gentleman, first staring Miss Nickleby out of countenance, and then grinning in delight at the achievement. "This cursed high room takes one's breath away. These infernal sky parlours. I'm afraid I must move, Nickleby." "I would, by all means," replied Ralph, looking bitterly round. "What a damned rum fellow you are, Nickleby," said the gentleman. "The damnedest, longest-headed, queerest-tempered old coiner of gold and silver ever was, damn it!" Having complimented Rafe to this effect, the gentleman rang the bell and stared at Miss Nickleby until it was answered, when he left off to bid the man desire his mistress to come directly, after which he began again, and left off no more until Madame Mantalini appeared. The dressmaker was a buxom person, handsomely dressed and rather good-looking, but much older than the gentleman in the Turkish trousers whom she had wedded some 6 months before. His name was originally Muntle, but it had been converted by an easy transition into Mantalini, the lady rightly considering that an English appellation would be of serious injury to the business. He had married on his whiskers, upon which property he had previously subsisted in a genteel manner for some years, and which he had recently improved after patient cultivation by the addition of a moustache, which promised to secure him an easy independence, his share in the labours of the business being at present confined to spending the money, and occasionally, when that ran short, driving to Mr. Rafe Nickleby to procure discount at a percentage for the customers' bills.
"My life," said Mr. Mantalini, "what a damned devil of a time you've been."
"I didn't even know Mr. Nickleby was here, my love," said Madame Mantalini.
"Then what a doubly damned infernal rascal that footman must be, my soul," remonstrated Mr. Mantalini.
"My dear," said Madame, "that is entirely your fault."
My fault? My heart's joy?
"Certainly," returned the lady. "What can you expect, dearest, if you will not correct the man?"
"Correct the man, my soul's delight?"
"Yes, I'm sure he wants speaking to badly enough," said Madame, pouting.
"Then do not vex itself," said Mr. Mantalini. "He shall be horsewhipped till he cries out damnably."
With this promise Mr. Mantalini kissed Madame Mantalini, and after that performance Madame Mantalini pulled Mr. Mantalini playfully by the ear, which done, they descended to business.
"Now, ma'am,"
said Rafe, who had looked on at all this with such scorn as few men can express in looks, "this is my niece."
"Just so, Mr. Nickleby," replied Madame Mantalini,
surveying Kate from head to foot and back again.
"Can you speak French, child?"
"Yes, ma'am," replied Kate, not daring to look up, for she felt that the eyes of the odious man in the dressing-gown were directed towards her.
"Like a damned native?" asked the husband.
Miss Nickleby offered no reply to this inquiry, but turned her back upon the questioner, as if addressing herself to make answer to what his wife might demand.
"We keep 20 young women constantly employed in the establishment," said Madame.
"Indeed, ma'am," replied Kate, timidly.
"Yes, and some of them damned handsome, too," said the master.
"Mantalini!" exclaimed his wife in an awful voice.
"My sense is idle," said Mantalini.
"Do you wish to break my heart?"
"Not for 20,000 hemispheres populated with little ballet dancers," replied Mantalini in a poetical strain.
"Then you will, if you persevere in that mode of speaking," said his wife. "What can Mr. Nickleby think when he hears you?"
"Oh, nothing, ma'am, nothing," replied Rafe. "I know his amiable nature and yours. Mere little remarks that give a zest to your daily intercourse. Lovers' quarrels that add sweetness to those domestic joys which promise to last so long. That's all. That's all."
Nicholas meets Mr. Crummles's company.
They passed a great many bills pasted against the walls and displayed in windows, wherein the names of Mr. Vincent Crummles, Mrs. Vincent Crummles, Master Crummles, Master P. Crummles, and Miss Crummles were printed in very large letters, and everything else in very small ones,
and turning at length into an entry in which was a strong smell of orange peel and lamp oil, with an undercurrent of sawdust, groped their way through a dark passage and, descending a step or two, threaded a little maze of canvas screens and paint-pots, and emerged upon the stage of the Portsmouth Theatre.
"Here we are," said Mr. Crummles.
It was not very light, but Nicholas found himself close to the first entrance on the prompt side, among bare walls, dusty scenes, mildewed clouds, heavily daubed draperies, and dirty floors. He looked about him. Ceiling, pit, boxes, gallery, orchestra, fittings and decorations of every kind, all looked coarse, cold, gloomy, and wretched.
"Is this a theatre?"
whispered Smike in amazement.
"I thought it was a blaze of light and finery."
"Why, so it is," replied Nicholas, hardly less surprised. "But not by day, Smike, not by day." The manager's voice recalled him from a more careful inspection of the building to the opposite side of the proscenium, where, at a small mahogany table with rickety legs and of an oblong shape, sat a stout, portly female, apparently between 40 and 50, in a tarnished silk cloak, with her bonnet dangling by the strings in her hand, and her hair, of which she had a great quantity, braided in a large festoon over each temple.
"Mr. Johnson," said the manager,
for Nicholas had given the name which Newman Noggs had bestowed upon him in conversation with Mrs. Kenwigs.
"Let me introduce Mrs. Vincent Crummles."
"I am glad to see you, sir,"
said Mrs. Vincent Crummles in a sepulchral voice.
"I am very glad to see you, and still more happy to hail you as a promising member of our corps."
The lady shook Nicholas by the hand as she addressed him in these terms. He saw it was a large one, but had not expected quite such an iron grip as that with which she honoured him.
"And this,"
said the lady, crossing to Smike, as tragic actresses cross when they obey a stage direction,
"and this is the other. You too are welcome, sir."
"He'll do, I think, my dear," said the manager, taking a pinch of snuff.
"He is admirable," replied the lady. "An acquisition indeed."
As Mrs. Vincent Crummles recrossed back to the table, there bounded onto the stage from some mysterious inlet a little girl in a dirty white frock with tucks up to the knees, short trousers, sandalled shoes, white spencer, pink gauze bonnet, green veil, and curl-papers, who turned a pirouette, cut twice in the air, turned another pirouette, then, looking off at the opposite wing, shrieked, bounded forward to within 6 inches of the footlights, and fell into a beautiful attitude of terror as a shabby gentleman in an old pair of buff slippers came in at one powerful slide, and, chattering his teeth, fiercely brandished a walking-stick.
"They are going through the Indian Savage and the Maiden," said Mrs. Crummles.
"Oh," said the manager, "the little ballet interlude. Very good. Go on. A little this way, if you please, Mr. Johnson. That'll do. Now."
The manager clapped his hands as a signal to proceed, and the savage, becoming ferocious, made a slide towards the maiden. But the maiden avoided him in 6 twirls, and came down at the end of the last one upon the very points of her toes. This seemed to make some impression upon the savage, for after a little more ferocity and chasing of the maiden into corners, he began to relent, and stroked his face several times with his right thumb and 4 fingers, thereby intimating that he was struck with admiration of the maiden's beauty. Acting upon the impulse of this passion, he, the savage, began to hit himself severe thumps in the chest, and to exhibit other indications of being desperately in love, which, being rather a prosy proceeding, was very likely the cause of the maiden's falling asleep. Whether it was or no, Asleep she did fall, sound as a church, on a sloping bank, and the savage, perceiving it, leant his left ear on his left hand, and nodded sideways, to intimate to all whom it might concern that she was asleep, and no shamming. Being left to himself, the savage had a dance all alone. Just as he left off, the maiden woke up, rubbed her eyes, got off the bank, and had a dance all alone too. Such a dance that the savage looked on in ecstasy all the while, and when it was done, plucked from a neighbouring tree some botanical curiosity, resembling a small pickled cabbage, and offered it to the maiden, who at first wouldn't have it, but on the savage shedding tears, relented. Then the savage jumped for joy, then the maiden jumped for rapture at the sweet smell of the pickled cabbage. Then the savage and the maiden danced violently together, and, finally, the savage dropped down on one knee, and the maiden stood on one leg upon his other knee, thus concluding the ballet, and leaving the spectators in a state of pleasing uncertainty whether she would ultimately marry the savage or return to her friends.
"Very well indeed," said Mr. Crummles. "Bravo!"
"Bravo!" cried Nicholas, resolved to make the best of everything. "Beautiful!"
"This, sir," said Mr. Vincent Crummles, bringing the maiden forward, "this is the infant phenomenon, Miss Ninetta Crummles."
"Your daughter?" inquired Nicholas.
My daughter, replied Mr. Vincent Crummles, "the idol of every place we go into, sir. We have had complimentary letters about this girl, sir, from the nobility and gentry of almost every town in England."
"I am not surprised at that," said Nicholas. "She must be quite a natural genius."
"Quite a—"
Mr. Crummles stopped. Language was not powerful enough to describe the infant phenomenon.
"I'll tell you what, sir," he said. "The talent of this child is not to be imagined. She must be seen, sir, seen, to be ever so faintly appreciated. There. Go to your mother, my dear."
"May I ask how old she is?" inquired Nicholas.
"You may, sir,"
replied Mr. Crummles, looking steadily in his questioner's face, as some men do when they have doubts about being implicitly believed in what they are going to say.
"She is 10 years of age, sir."
"Not more?"
"Not a day."
"Dear me," said Nicholas, "it's extraordinary." It was. For the infant phenomenon, though of short stature, had a comparatively aged countenance, and had, moreover, been precisely the same age, not perhaps to the full extent of the memory of the oldest inhabitant, but certainly for 5 good years. But she had been kept up late every night, and put upon an unlimited allowance of gin and water from infancy to prevent her growing tall, and perhaps this system of training had produced in the infant phenomenon these additional phenomena.
Mrs. Nickleby and the man next door.
"I was going to ask, Mamma, before you were married, had you many suitors?"
"Suitors, my dear,"
cried Mrs. Nickleby with a smile of wonderful complacency.
"First and last, Kate, I must have had 12 at least."
"Mamma," returned Kate in a tone of remonstrance.
"I had indeed, my dear," said Mrs. Nickleby,
"not including your poor papa, or a young gentleman who used to go at that time to the same dancing school, and who would send gold watches and bracelets to our house in gilt-edged paper, which were always returned,
and who afterwards unfortunately went out to Botany Bay in a convict ship, and escaped into a bush and killed sheep. I don't know how they got there, and was going to be hung, only he accidentally choked himself, and the government pardoned him. Then there was young Lukin, said Mrs. Nickleby, beginning with her left thumb and checking off the names on her fingers, Mogley, Tipslark, Cabbery, Smithser. Having now reached her little finger, Mrs. Nickleby was carrying the account over to the other hand when a loud "Help!" which appeared to come from the very foundation of the garden wall, gave both herself and her daughter a violent start. "Mamma, what was that?" said Kate, in a low tone of voice. "Upon my word, my dear," returned Mrs. Nickleby, considerably startled, "unless it was the gentleman belonging to the next house, I don't know what it could possibly—"
"Ahead!"
cried the same voice, and that not in the tone of an ordinary clearing of the throat, but in a kind of bellow which woke up all the echoes in the neighbourhood, and was prolonged to an extent which must have made the unseen bellower quite black in the face. "I understand it now, my dear," said Mrs. Nickleby, laying her hand on Kate's. "Don't be alarmed, my love. It's not directed to you, and is not intended to frighten anybody. Let us give everybody their due, Kate. I am bound to say that." So saying, Mrs. Nickleby nodded her head and patted the back of her daughter's hand a great many times, and looked as if she could tell something vastly important if she chose, but had self-denial, thank heaven, and wouldn't do it. "What do you mean, mamma?" demanded Kate, in evident surprise. "Don't be flurried, my dear," replied Mrs. Nickleby, looking towards the garden wall, "for you see I'm not. And if it would be excusable in anybody to be flurried, it certainly would, under all the circumstances, be excusable in me, but I am not, Kate, not at all." "It seems designed to attract our attention, mamma," said Kate. "It is designed to attract our attention, my dear, at least," rejoined Mrs. Nickleby, drawing herself up and patting her daughter's hand more blandly than before, "to attract the attention of one of us. You needn't be at all uneasy, my dear." Kate looked very much perplexed, and was apparently about to ask for further explanation, when a shouting and scuffling noise, as of an elderly gentleman whooping and kicking up his legs on loose gravel with great violence, was heard to proceed from the same direction as the former sounds, and before they had subsided, a large cucumber was seen to shoot up in the air with the velocity of a skyrocket, whence it descended, tumbling over and over until it fell at Mrs. Nickleby's feet. This remarkable appearance was succeeded by another of a precisely similar description. Then a fine vegetable marrow of unusually large dimensions was seen to whirl aloft and come toppling down. Then several cucumbers shot up together, and finally the air was darkened by a shower of onions, turnip radishes, and other small vegetables, which fell rolling and scattering and bumping about in all directions. As Kate rose from her seat in some alarm and caught her mother's hand to run with her into the house, she felt herself rather retarded than assisted in her intention, and following the direction of Mrs. Nickleby's eyes, was quite terrified by the apparition of an old black velvet cap, which, by slow degrees, as if its wearer were ascending a ladder or pair of steps, rose above the wall dividing their garden from that of the next cottage, which, like their own, was a detached building, and was gradually followed by a very large head and an old face, in which were a pair of most extraordinary grey eyes, very wild, very wide open, and rolling in their sockets with a dull, languishing, leering look most ugly to behold. "Mamma!" cried Kate, really terrified for the moment. "Why do you stop? Why do you lose an instant? Mamma, pray come in!" "Kate, my dear," returned her mother, still holding back, "how can you be so foolish? I'm ashamed of you. How do you suppose you are ever to get through life if you're such a coward as this?" "What do you want, sir?" said Mrs. Nickleby, addressing the intruder with a sort of simpering displeasure. "How dare you look into this garden?"
"Queen of my soul," replied the stranger, folding his hands together, "this goblet, sip."
"Nonsense, sir," said Mrs. Nickleby. "Kate, my love, pray be quiet."
"Won't you sip the goblet?"
urged the stranger, with his head imploringly on one side and his right hand on his breast.
"Oh, do sip the goblet."
"I shall not consent to do anything of the kind, sir," said Mrs. Nickleby. "Pray be gone."
"Why is it?"
said the old gentleman, coming up a step higher and leaning his elbows on the wall with as much complacency as if he were looking out of window.
"Why is it that beauty is always obdurate, even when admiration is as honourable and respectful as mine?"
Here he smiled, kissed his hand, and made several low bows.
"Is it owing to the bees, who, when the honey season is over, and they are supposed to have been killed with brimstone, in reality fly to Barbary, and lull the captive Moors to sleep with their drowsy songs? Or is it,"
he added, dropping his voice almost to a whisper,
"in consequence of the statue at Charing Cross having been lately seen on the Stock Exchange at midnight, walking arm in arm with the pump from Aldgate in a riding habit?"
"Mamma," murmured Kate, "do you hear him?" "Hush, my dear," replied Mrs. Nickleby in the same tone of voice. "He is very polite, and I think that was a quotation from the poets. Pray don't worry me so. You'll pinch my arm black and blue. Go away, sir."
"Quite away,"
said the gentleman with a languishing look.
"Oh, quite away."
"Yes," returned Mrs. Nickleby, "certainly. You have no business here. This is private property, sir. You ought to know that."
"I do know,"
said the old gentleman, laying his finger on his nose with an air of familiarity most reprehensible,
"that this is a sacred and enchanted spot, where the most divine charms—"
Here he kissed his hand and bowed again,
"waft mellifluousness over the neighbours' gardens, and force the fruit and vegetables into premature existence. That fact I am acquainted with. But will you permit me, fairest creature, to ask you one question in the absence of the planet Venus, who has gone on business to the Horse Guards and would otherwise, jealous of your superior charms, interpose between us?"
"Kate," observed Mrs. Nickleby, turning to her daughter, "it's very awkward, positively. I really don't know what to say to this gentleman. One ought to be civil, you know." "Dear mamma," rejoined Kate, "don't say a word to him, but let us run away as fast as we can and shut ourselves up till Nicholas comes home."
These extracts have been taken from the unabridged recording of Nicholas Nickleby, read by David Horowitz for Naxos Audiobooks.